Okay, this is 2.4 on rational numbers, estimating square roots of rational numbers. The first question says, Max said that the square root of 6.4 is 3.2. So before you go any further, what you need to be able to do is translate what this says. Okay, so Max says the square root of 6.4. So if I say the square root of 6.4, that's how I write it. So he said that the square root of 6.4 is 3.2. And Lynda claimed that the square root of 6.4 was 0.8. This was Max. This was Lynda. And this is Jamila. She said the square root of 6.4 is about 2.5. All right. So all three of these are estimations. Now, what Max did, and here's what he did wrong. Max was not right, and here's why. He thought that the square root of a number, let's say the square root of 6, is simply taking that number and dividing it by 2 to get 3. And that's not what square root means. The square root of a number means what number when multiplied by itself will give you 64. So what number when multiplied by itself gives you 6.4? And if you said 3.2, we know that 3.2 times 3.2 has to be greater than 9 because 3 times 3 is 9. So therefore, Max couldn't possibly be right with that answer. So Max is wrong. Now Lynda, she said, well, you know what though? I know that 64 is 8 times 8. And therefore, the square root of 6.4 is probably 0.8 because 8 times 8 is 64. But the problem with that thinking is if I put the same thing, what number times itself equals 6.4, and if I put 0.8 in there and 0.8 in there, well, I know that a number less than 1 times itself can't be 6 because 1 times 1, which is greater on both sides, is just 1. So therefore, Lynda can't possibly be right either. However, Jamila said the square root of 6.4. So what number multiplied by itself is 6.4? And she said, well, maybe 2.5. And she's right, and here's why. If I think about what 2 squared is, 2 squared is 4. Another way to think about that is to say the square root of 4 is 2. And the square root of 9 is 3. So therefore, if I was to put 5, 6, 7, 8, if I was to put the square root of 5 here, the square root of 6 here, the square root of 7 here, and the square root of 8 here, I would know that all of these would have square roots of 2 decimal something. Right, 2 decimal something. And if I was to think about 2 decimal 5, that's going to be right in the middle there. Somewhere around there would be 2 decimal 5, which means 2 decimal 5 times 2 decimal 5 does make sense that it's a square root of roughly 6.4 because it would be between those two numbers. Okay, question number 2. It says, without calculating any square roots, identify the square roots that have values between 4.5 and 5.5. And then it says, explain your reasoning. So it gives you a list of 7 different square roots. And they're all irrational numbers because they're not going to have perfect squares, but they're going to have approximate square roots. So what I want to do is I want to start off again with a number line. And I want to say the square root of what number, because I know it has between 4.5. The square root of what number, I can use x if I want, is 4.5. And the square root of what number is 5.5. So I'm going to figure out what these two x values, or what these two x and y values, I suppose, would be. So if I wanted to figure out what number would go under the square root sign, I could really just take my calculator and say, what is 4.5 times itself, or squared? And it's 20.25. So therefore, the square root of 20.25 is 4.5. And if I do the same thing for 5.5, I square that, it's going to be 30.25. So I know the square root of 20.25 is 4.5, and the square root of 30.25 is 5.5. So any number between 20.25 and 30.25, any number that's between those two square roots is going to have a square root that's between 4.5 and 5.5. So if I look at this, this one is between that range. So the square root of 21.3 should be between 4.5 and 5.5. If I take my calculator, I go 21.3 and press the square root button. It is 4.6, which would be right around here maybe. 20.1 would be just a little bit before that because 20.25 is there. So that is not one number that has it. 31.7 does not have a square root because it would be past 5.5 or past 30.25. This one would because it's in between there. This one would not because it's after 30.25. This one would, and this one would. So those four numbers out of the 7 would all have square roots between 4.5 and 5.5. So I took my calculator just to double check at the last one. 30.2, press the square root button, and the answer is 5.49, which is still between 4.5 and 5.5. Question number 5 says, use the diagram to identify a rational number with a square root between 3 and 4. So the first things you kind of have to see here, and I'll just use a different color marker. I'll use red. This square right here is one square, okay? And if I take that square and bring it over here, I know based on the measurements, 1, 2, 3, that is a 3 by 3 square, which would mean its area would be 9. If I grab a green marker and trace this one and bring it down, that is going, oh, that's not the one I wanted to do. Take this here and bring it down here. That is a 4 by 4 square with an area of 16. So using a blue marker, this blue one right here is what it's asking you. It has identify the rational number with a square root between 3 and 4. So we don't know if that's a half. We can assume it's a half, but we want to know what is that approximately. So if I estimate this to be a square that is 3.5 and 3.5, roughly, the area would be the product of those two. So if I'm estimating or identifying it doesn't say estimate, but I can actually take 3.5, 3.5, and if I square it or multiply it by itself, 3.5 times 3.5, I would get an area of 12.25. So therefore, what is a number that has a square root between 3 and 4? Well, 12.25 would have a square root between 3 and 4. But another way for us to do that without using the area model, I could have just used that number line like we did in the last question. And I could have said, listen, the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. So if I want to find any number that has a square root between 3 and 4, I could choose absolutely any number. Square root of 10 would be 1. Square root of 11 would be 1. Square root of 12.394 would be 1. Any number that's between the square root of 9 and 6, any number between 9 and 16, which are infinite numbers, would have square roots between 3 and 4. And let's just choose some really crazy number. Let's go with 12.3947. So the square root of that should be between 3 and 4. So the square root of 12.397, square root should be between 3 and 4, and it is. It's 3.5, right? So any number that falls between 9 and 16 will have a square root between 3 and 4. Question 6, identify a rational number with a square root between 0.7 and 0.8. Again, probably the easiest way to do it is to say 0.7 and 0.8. Well, what number has a square root of 0.7? In order for me to find that number, I can take my calculator and go, what is decimal 7 multiplied by itself? And the answer is 0.49. So the square root of 0.49 is decimal 7. And without using a calculator, I could probably be pretty sure that the square root of 0.64 is decimal 8. So any number that falls between 0.49 and 0.64, any number will have a square root between decimal 7 and decimal 8. So just to be clear, if I put something in between there like 0.55, the square root of that, which is somewhere in between there, would have a square root between decimal 7 and decimal 8, probably close to decimal 7.5 really. Grab my calculator and said, what is the square roots of decimal 5.5? And it's 0.74, which is between 0.7 and 0.8. Okay. Again, the questions, these are really hard questions to understand when it's drawn for you, but it is very difficult to create this number line to be able to help you figure out what it's actually asking. That's the hard part. Question 7, estimate and calculate the number that has the given square root. So what number, this is a different phrasing, what number has a square root of approximately 3.1? Well, since I know the square root of 9 is 3, then I could say, well, maybe the square root of 10 is approximately 3.1, right? That seems reasonable. I'll show you with a number line. So it's the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. The square root of, therefore, maybe 10-ish would be 3.1, and I'm not sure. If we wanted to figure out the actual answer, if I wanted to figure out the actual answer, instead of saying the square root of 10, I could take my calculator, and without estimating, but calculating, go 3 times 3.1 squared, or multiplied by itself, is 9.61. So the actual answer is the square root of 9.61 is equal to 3.1. That's a true statement. But my estimation was the square root of 10 is approximately 3.1, which was pretty close. The next one, if I wanted to calculate it, what number has a square root? What number has a square root of 12.5? Well, I could take my calculator and go 12.5 multiplied by itself, right? And I'm not going to do that right yet. I'm going to do estimation first. Use my number line. Well, I know that 12 times 12, or the square root of 144, is 12, and the square root of 169 is 13. So right in the middle would be 12.5. So really I'm looking for a number that's midway between 144 and 169, probably maybe the square root of 156 or so, something like that. But if I wanted to figure it out for sure, so I'm going to say the square root of 156 is probably approximately 12.5. That's my answer based on my number line. And I have no idea if it is or not. But then I take my calculator and I could do one of two things. What is the actual answer? So the square root of what number is exactly 12.5? That is approximately equal to. I could take 12.5, multiply it by itself, and the actual answer is 156.25. So my answer was pretty close. I said based on the number line alone, the square root of 156 was it, but it was 156.25. The next question, again, you're setting at what number has a square root of 0.62. This is going to be a lot harder. This is going to be a lot harder, but we'll see how it goes. So my number line, I have to be fairly familiar with decimal numbers that has square roots of decimals. So the first one I'm going to write down here is a 0.49. And the square root of 0.49 is 0.7. And the square root of 0.64 is 0.8. Okay, those are perfect squares. So therefore, what number has a square root of 0.62? I'm going to put that on the number line right about here. Okay? Now to help you out, I'm going to actually erase all this stuff now. I'm just going to ask the question, if this was a number line, say what number is that point that's between 0.7 and 0.8, you would probably say something like maybe 0.78, probably something like that, right? So what number has a square root of 0.62? I'm going to say the square root of 0.78 is approximately 0.62. And that looks weird because what number multiplied by itself, you would think that that number would have to be significantly different, but it's not. Grab my calculator and see what is the square root of 0.78 and 0.88. Did I make a mistake there? Oh no, sorry, that's my fault. The square root of, yeah, sorry, the square root of 78. I made a mistake there. Oops, I did the whole question wrong. Let's try this again. Okay, my fault. So it says calculate the number that has a given square root. So I know the square root. I want to find something that falls between 0.6 and 0.7. So since 0.6, the square root of 0.36 would be 30. Would be decimal 6 as the square root, and the square root of 0.49 is decimal 7. The square root of 0.62 is roughly there, which would mean if I'm guessing, it has to be probably not too far away from 0.36. I'm going to guess approximately the square root of 0.38. Maybe the square root of 0.39, something like that, or maybe 37. Take my calculator, put decimal 62 and press the square root sign. 0.78, which is pretty darn close. Sorry, square root of 38, sorry. Square root of 38 is 0.61, which is close to 0.62. So your answer for this one, boy, I screwed that one up pretty good. I apologize. 0.38. And the last one, So for this one, I'm going to choose the square root of 0.2 and the square root of 0.3. Oh, no, that's wrong again. Oh my God. 0.2 down here and 0.3 here. And then I'm going to put, what is 0.2, what number has a square root for 0.2? I'm going to put 0.2 multiplied by itself. That's going to be 0.04. A lot of people think it's going to be 0.4, but it's not. And 0.3 times 0.3 is 0.09. And 0.29 is going to be right here. So I'm going to have something that's really close to that. So I'm going to guess it's 0.08 or maybe 0.085 or something like that would be a good guess for what number has a square root. So a square root of one of those two. Take my calculator. And what is the square root of 0.08? Press the square root button. 0.28, which is pretty close to 0.29. If I even took my other one, 0.085, and press the square root button, I'm even closer with 0.291. But the answer is therefore the square root of 0.08, or if you want to get even more, 0.085, something like that. Question 8, estimate and calculate the area of each square given its side length. So if I give you a square and I tell you the side length is 4.3 centimeters, and I say, what is a good estimation for the area? Well, you'd say, well, 4 times 4 is 16, 5 times 5 is 25, so maybe like a little bit less than 20, maybe like 19-ish. 4.3 times 4.3, and I can show you just 4 squared would be 16. 5 squared would be 25, so 4.3 squared would be somewhere right there, and there would be probably 19-ish. Let's just look. Take my calculator out and go, what is 4.3 squared? It's 18.45. That's not too bad. So 18-ish or 19-ish if I didn't use a calculator. Those would be your guesses. And your last one, it was 0.035 kilometers. So what I'm really going to ask myself is, well, let's just use something I can do. So let's make it, instead of that one, let's make it 0.04. Let's round it up and say that. So what would that number be times itself? Okay. Well, if I think about that, this is 4 hundredths times 4 hundredths, or 16 over 10,000, because 100 times 100 is 10,000, and 16 thousandths, tenths, 100,000 is 10,000, 16 10,000ths is that number right there. So if the area, if the side length was 0.35 kilometers, a good estimation for the area would be 0.0016 kilometers squared. And that seems counterintuitive because we think it's going to be bigger than the number it started with. But if we take a look here, and if I said 0.035 multiplied by itself, the answer is 0.001225. So my estimation of 0.0016 is not too far from the actual calculation. Question number 9, is each of the following rational numbers a perfect square? And explain. So remember, if this is a perfect square, then its square root will be possible. So the square root of 1/16 will be possible to give you an equal symbol, not an approximately equal symbol. And since it's a fraction, what fraction multiplied by itself gives you 1/16 will tell you what the square root is. What numerator would you need to have there? Well, 1 times 1 is 1. What denominator would you need? 4 times 4. So therefore, the square root of 1/16 is a quarter. Okay. Now, since the next one is the square root of 5 over 9, a perfect square, since I cannot write this, what fraction times itself is 5/19? There is no numerator. Some people think it's 2.5 and 2.5. Well, 2.5 times 2.5 is not 5. 2.5 plus 2.5 is 5. The denominator works. 3 times 3 is 9. But since the numerator does not work, this is not a perfect square. Naps. Not a perfect square. Now in questions C and D, you're given decimals. And what we learned in our practice questions, when it's a decimal, the first thing you have to do is read it as 36 hundredths, right? You have to be able to read decimals properly. And once you read it properly, you can write it as a fraction 36 hundredths. Now, is this fraction, since it's the same thing as decimal, a perfect square? Well, what fraction times itself would give you 36? That's 6 times 6 is 36. 10 times 10 is 100. So therefore, the square root of 36 hundredths as a fraction would be 6 tenths. And therefore, the square root of 0.36 as a decimal would be 6 tenths, which is 0.6, because this is 6 tenths. And the last one, D, 9 tenths. So the first thing I'm going to read it is 9 tenths. Then I'm going to write it as a fraction, 9 tenths. What fraction times itself gives you 9 tenths? Well, 3 times 3 gives me 9. That works. But there is no number times itself that gives you 10. Therefore, 9 tenths is not a perfect square. Question 10, determine whether each rational number is a perfect square. So is 7/12 a perfect square? Same question as we did before. Is there a fraction that multiplied by itself that gives you 7/12? The answer is no, because there is no number that multiplies by itself to give you 7, and there is no number that multiplies by itself to give you 12. So therefore, 7/12 is not a perfect square. Question B, what fraction times itself is 100 over 49? This is a perfect square because the numerator would be 10. 10 times 10 is 100, and 9 times 9 is 49. So therefore, if I ask you the question, what is the square root of 149ths? You would say it is 10 ninths or 1 1/9. Another question I might have asked you, instead of asking you this way, I might have said, what is the square root of 2, which is 98 and 2 49ths? Because 2 and 2 49ths and 149ths are the same number, just improper mixed. And the answer for this would be 1 1/9 or 10 ninths. Is 0.1 a perfect square? So 1.1 is actually read as 1/10, which is 1 over 10. What fraction times itself is 1 over 10? Well, 1 times 1 is 10. But there is no number that multiplies by itself to get you 10. So therefore, it is not a perfect square. There is no square root for 0.1 that would stop. And if I want to check my calculator, I say, what is the square root of 0.1? It gives you an irrational number, a non-repeating, non-terminating decimal. And finally, the other one, what is 1/100th? So it would be 1 over 100. What fraction times itself is 100? Well, 1 times 1 and 10 times 10. So yes, it is a perfect square. And if I said, what is the square root of 0.01? The answer would be 1/10, which is 0.1. Take my calculator just to double check. Square root button, 1/10. Okay, what is the square root of 324? It says evaluate. So for these ones, you can use a calculator. So what is the square root of 324? Grab your calculator, press square root. It's 18. All right, for that one there. For the second one, 2.2 and 89 hundredths, I'm going to change this to this question here, 2 and 89 hundredths. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because that's going to be the same question as what is the square root of 289 over 100? So what fraction times itself is 289 over 100? Well, I know that 10 times 10 is 100. I can do that one. But 289 is actually 17 times 17. So 17 times 17 is 289. If you don't believe me, just take 289 and say, what's the square root of it? And it says 17. So therefore, the answer for this question would be 17 tenths. But since it started off as a decimal, remember 1 and 7 tenths is the same thing as 17 tenths. Your answer would be 1 and 7 tenths, which is 1 decimal 7. The next one is 225. Same thing would be the square root of 225 tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10 thousandths. So the same question written as a fraction rather than decimal would be what's the square root of 225 10 thousandths? What fraction times itself is 225? That's 15 and 15. What number multiplied by itself is 10,000? That's 100 times 100. So therefore, what's the square root of that? It would be 15 hundredths, which is 0.15. Double check with your calculator. What is the square root of decimal 0.225? Is that the one? Or maybe I think, yeah, 0.225. There you go. Square root button The answer is 15 hundredths. And the last question was the square root of 2025. Well, that's too hard to do using our methods that we're using. So put 2025 in and press the square root button, and you get 45. Calculate the side length of each square from its area. So if the area is 169, the square root of 169 will be the side length. This comes right from Pythagoras. So the exact measure would be 169, square root of 169, or 13 meters, because that's the square root of 169. Harder question. What is the square root of, if the area is 0.16, what is the square root of 0.16? Since it has a perfect square, it doesn't say estimate, it says calculate. That's the same question saying 16 hundredths. So square root of what times what would be 4 over 4 and 10 over 10. So therefore, if the area was 16 millimeters squared, the side length would be 0.4 millimeters. Let's just check. So 0.16, if I square root that, the side length should be 0.4. And question 17. Some parks contain fenced gardens. Suppose that it costs $80 to build a meter of fence, including materials and labor. How much does it cost to enclose a square with an area of 120 meters squared? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out if I have a square area of 120 meters squared. I can estimate the size of the fence by saying I know that the exact measurement of that is going to be the square root of 120. And since I know the square root of 121 to be 11, I'm pretty sure the square root of 120 is going to be like 10 decimal 9 or so. But I grab a calculator, say what is the square root of 120? Is 10 decimal 9 5 or 10 decimal, we'll just use 10 decimal 9. It's 5, we'll use that. So the side length, I would just use 10 decimal 9, we'll make it easier. Okay? So if it costs $80 to build each meter, I'll make it 10.95. How much is it going to cost to do all 4 sides of this fence? So we really need to know what the perimeter is. So the perimeter of this garden will be 10.95. And since there are 4 sides multiplied by 4, the perimeter around the outside of this garden is 43.8 meters around. 10.95 plus 10.95 plus 10.95 plus 10.95, right? And if it costs $80 to beat each meter of fence, including the labor, I'm going to multiply each of those meters by 80. So 43.8 multiplied by the cost of 80 meters per meter, and it's going to be $3,504 for building that fence around that. Predict whether the cost of the enclosure of 2 squares, each with an area of 60 meters squared, is the same. So instead of doing 120 meters squared, what if you did 2 fences that were 60 meters squared each? Would it cost more or less to do 2 of these? Okay, so let's figure it out. Since we already know that the perimeter of 120 meters squared would be 43.8 meters, let's check to see how big this would be. So the area is 60 meters squared, so therefore the side length will be the square root of 60. Grab my calculator. What is the square root of 60? Probably 7.7. 7.74. So therefore the side length of this particular enclosure will be 7.7 meters, roughly. And the perimeter will be all 4 of those added together, or 7.7 times 4. That's 30.8. So one 60 meter squared area will have 30.8 meters of fence. Okay? Remember, one 120 meter squared area had a perimeter of 43.8. So it says, will the cost of the enclosure be the same, or will it be more or less? So I have to double this, because not only am I doing this 60 meters squared, I'm going to do this one as well, which means I'm going to have 61.6 meters of perimeter with 260 meters squared as opposed to 120 meters squared. And that's because if you think about it, if I was to erase a circle here, hang on a second. Let me just do a different one. So if this is 60 meters squared, and right next to it I have 60 meters squared, this would be 120. But this part right here, I have to fence twice when I have them separated as I do if I have because that's all I'd have. That's all I'd have to fence if I did 120 meters squared as one rectangle, right? But if it's two separate ones, I have to do this fence twice. And question 20, Leon's rectangular living room is 8.2 by 4.5 meters. So I'm going to draw his living room, 8 by 8.2 meters and 4.5 meters as a living room. This is his living room. A rug covers 2/5 of the area of the floor, a square rug. So square rug, I'll just make a square rug right there. Covers 2/5 of the area. What is the side length of the rug to the nearest tenth of a meter? So the first thing I have to do is take this rug out of the room. I want to figure out what is the area of the entire room. So in order to get the area, I need to use the formula area equals length times width. Area equals 8.2 multiplied by 4.5. Grab my calculator. 8.2 times 4.5 equals 36.9 meters. Okay, that's roughly the area of the entire room. And if this rug, I'll have to erase this, 36.9 meters squared. If this rug, when I put it in the room, takes up 2/5 of the area, it takes up 2/5 of the 36.9 square meter room. Okay? So there's two ways I can do it. I could first do it as a fraction, 2 over 5 of 36.9 and multiply a fraction by a whole number. Or alternatively, think of 2/5 as a decimal, which is 4/10, because 2/5 and 4/10 are equivalent fractions, and therefore it's that. So 4/10 of 36.9. Obviously, given the two types of questions, either 2/5 times 36.9 or 4/10 times 36.9, I think most of us would probably choose the multiplication of decimals, because I can just grab my calculator and go 2/5 or 4/10 of 36.9 is 14.76. So the area, since it takes up 2/5 of the room, I'm going to erase that 2/5 next. I don't need it anymore. The area of that rug takes up 14.76 meters squared of the room. Of the 36.9 meters squared that the entire room has, that rug takes up 2/5 of it, or 14.76 square meters. But remember, that's not the answer. That's not the question. The question is asking us, what is the side length of that? So since the area is that, the square root of 14.76 will be the side length. Grab my calculator. 14.76 square root is roughly 3.8. So therefore, here's your final answer. Therefore, the side length of the rug is exactly the square root of 14.76, or approximately equal to 3.8 meters.